This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me.
Hello, my name is Charlene Garcia Sims, and I'm the Genealogy and Special Collections Librarian here at Rollins Library. And I can't believe that it's been 18 months since I asked Ray Brown in January 2020 to make a presentation in honor of Martin Luther King Day on the history of the first Black doctors in Pueblo and the United States. And it was amazing how little information we found. So we kept mining and finally we came up with some amazing things, and you will see that in Ray's presentation. Ray Brown is an Army veteran born and raised in Colorado Springs until the age of 14 when he moved to Great Britain with his family and graduated from Lincoln Heath High School, Royal Air Force. He attended Trinidad Junior College before transferring to Southern Colorado State College and graduated from the University of Southern Colorado with a degree in political science. He was commissioned as second lieutenant in the U.S. Army for 7 years and then went into manufacturing business for 17 years. He then became a vocational high school teacher in Fort Lupton, and I thought it was really interesting that he also taught civics, which I think we really need today. He retired and now works at Roseland Cemetery. And Ray was always interested in history, but he was in Fort Huachuca, Arizona. He discovered it was a segregated post, and Buffalo soldiers were stationed there, thus his interest in military history. It has done so many things for preserving military graves, and especially in Roseland, and I don't think I'll have time to talk about it, but he deserves a lot of credit. He also, of course, is interested in African American history. He grew up in the Civil Rights Movement, which piqued his attention to many topics. And I had the honor of introducing him to Bruce Steele, who was the founder of the Martin Luther King Center in the library, in the Special Collections Department in 2013. So he reminded me of that earlier today, that I was the one that introduced him. And as they say, after he met Ruth, the rest is lots of history written and presented, and you're in for a treat today.
Hello, my name is Ray Brown, and I'm here to give a presentation on early African American doctors, including the doctors that were brought to Pueblo, Colorado. And we'll talk a little bit about history, because I find that history helps people to really get a good setting on where we're at. So just to begin with, we have a video presentation that talks about the Civil War and the initial or first doctors that were of the African American race and how they got to become part of the Civil War, and we'll pick it up from there.
As more and more African Americans began to officially enlist into the Union Army, Army hospitals reluctantly employed African American medical doctors, surgeons, and nurses to provide medical care to Black soldiers. Many of the white officers that led the colored troops were uncomfortable with the Black doctors and nurses, but the Union Army was unable to always provide a white doctor in their place. On April 14, 1863, Alexander Thomas Augusta became the first of only 8 Black physicians commissioned into the Union Army. Born free on March 8, 1825, in Norfolk, Virginia, Alexander Augusta first worked as a barber. Interested in medicine, he applied to the University of Pennsylvania, but was denied due to his race. He traveled to Toronto, where he studied at the University of Trinity College, and in 1856 he graduated and established his own medical practice. At the onset of the Civil War, Augusta wrote a letter to President Abraham Lincoln offering his services, stating, "I beg leave to apply to you for an appointment as surgeon to some of the colored regiments, or as physician to some of the depots of freedmen." Augusta returned to the United States and was commissioned into the Union Army's 7th U.S. Colored Troops as a major, making him the highest-ranking black officer in the Union Army. Many white officers were resentful of Augusta's high rank and were uncomfortable with the black surgeon. In his first post at Camp Stanton, Maryland, the white assistant surgeons refused to serve under an African American and requested that he be removed. Augusta was then placed at the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C. as the first African-American surgeon-in-chief, where he managed several African-American surgeons, including John H. Rapier, Anderson R. Abbott, and William P. Powell. In 1868, Augusta joined the faculty at Howard University's first medical school, becoming the first African-American faculty member.
During the Civil War, there were 13 African-American doctors that were invited to participate as medical professionals during the war itself. And the one gentleman that you saw in the video that they talked about was Alexander Thomas Augusta. And this gentleman was from Virginia. He came to the conclusion that he was not going to be allowed into a medical school in the United States, so he went to Toronto, Canada, and started his medical program there. That was back in 1855. When the war broke out, Dr. Augusta was actually in a practice in Toronto, and he wrote a letter to President Lincoln requesting for permission to come back to the United States and perform as a doctor and surgeon in the United States. During the Civil War, there were 13 African-American physicians that served with the Union Army. 3 of these men were commissioned officers, and 10 served as contract surgeon assistant surgeons for the government. All of these men served with the United States Colored Troops in various freedmen hospitals, and they worked with African-American patients only. Alexander Thomas Augusta, John Van Sully de Grasse, and David McCord were those 3 officers. In 1850, Alexander Thomas Augusta enrolled in Trinity College at the University of Toronto in Canada. He was commissioned as a major in 1863 with the 7th United States Colored Troops and became the highest ranking African-American officer in the United States Army at that time. His position was as a physician and a surgeon. After 2 white assistant surgeons complained to President Lincoln about having to report to a black officer, President Lincoln transferred Augusta to a contraband or freedmen's hospital in Washington, D.C., where he became the first black hospital administrator. In 1865, Major Augusta was promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, and that is the highest ranking military officer for a black American. He was mustered out of the Army in 1866. After the military, Augustus was in charge of the Lincoln Hospital in Savannah, Georgia, until 1868, when he started his own practice in Washington, D.C. He became the first black medical professor as one of the original members of the newly formed medical college at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Despite the financial hardships of the young institution, Augusta, despite being the financial hardships of the young institution, Augusta remained there until 1877. He also served at the Smallpox Hospital and the Freedman Hospital in Washington, D.C. Augusta encouraged young Black medical students to persevere, and to help make Howard University an early success. He died in Washington in 1890 and was the first Black officer to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The life of Alexander Thomas Augusta can be summed up in a single word, and that word would be determination. There were 10 contract surgeons that we called them acting assistant surgeons that were employed during the Civil War. It's little known about their lives after they served in the Civil War. But if you'll Anderson R Abbott returned to his native Canada and became a county coroner. Bozeman served in the reconstituted South Carolina legislature in 1868 and later became the postmaster of Charleston, South Carolina. Harris stayed in Virginia and was a candidate for lieutenant governor in 1869. And Reville became the bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. During the Civil War, the women also were included, and even though nursing was not a woman's job before the Civil War, but by 1865 there were over 3,000 women nurses who served the war effort. None of the African American women were included in that number, nor were they recognized for their services for decades to come. Some were paid, but most were not. They served as nurses in convalescent homes and government hospitals. The United States Navy enlisted several of these nurses on hospital ships, namely the USS Red Rover. The USS Red Rover was a converted Confederate paddle wheel steamer that was captured and turned into the first Navy hospital ship under the direction of the Sisters of the Holy Cross. Anne Bradford Stokes is a well-known African-American woman who served as a nurse on the USS Red Rover from January 1863 to October of 1864. She was one of the first women to enlist in the Navy and serve as a nurse. Later, she became the first woman to apply for and be awarded a pension for her military service. It was quite interesting for me to find out that Dr. Rebecca Lee Crumpler had earned a place in the New England Female Medical College in 1860. So this is prior to the war. The school was the first in the country to train women medical doctors. At the time, many men argued that women were too delicate or not intelligent enough to become doctors. Most medical schools barred Black students regardless of their gender. The New England Female Medical College initially trained women to work only as midwives. Their focus changed as they grew in their stature. Dr. Crumpler graduated from New England Female Medical College in 1864, becoming the first female African-American doctor. Her official degree was Doctoress of Medicine. She began practicing in Boston, but by the end of the Civil War, found herself drawn to Richmond, Virginia, which was as a proper field for real missionary work. She collaborated with the Freedmen's Bureau and other charity and missionary groups to care for freed African Americans. Many of her patients were very poor and would otherwise have had no access to medical care. The enormous need of these patients and the discrimination that they faced from many white doctors encouraged an increased number of African Americans to seek medical training. Dr. Crumpler continued her practice and returned to Boston in late 1860. She's treated patients in and around her home on Joy Street in Beacon Hill. At times, a mainly black neighborhood, and regardless of whether they could pay or not. Now, even though you think this presentation is about Pueblo directly, I wanted to give you some history so that you kind of understood where we were as a nation and how these African-American medical professionals got into their business. There were several historical black colleges in Nashville, Tennessee. And in fact, Nashville is the home for 4 historically black colleges: Tennessee State University, Fisk University, Mahari College, and the American Baptist Colleges all exist in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm going to speak specifically about Mahari because the doctors that came to Pueblo, a couple of them actually attended school at Mahari Medical College, which was established in 1876 through the efforts of Dr. George W. Hubbard, Dr. William Sneed, and Samuel Mahari. This is the only AMA accredited, privately endowed, prominently Negro medical school in the world. During its first 90 years of service, it trained more Negro physicians and dentists than any other institution in the United States. Here's a picture of a graduating class out of Mahari Medical College. This class was 1907. Remember again that in 1876, Mahari Medical College was created to teach former slaves the healing arts. It was dedicated to eliminating health disparities through education, research, and patient care. This next photo is a photo of a graduating class of Mahari Medical School. Again, this year was 1907. Again, one of the things that I think was important to note was as we talk about the medical practice, we need to really understand what was going on in the United States at the time. Nationally, there was discriminatory policies in the 1900s. These discriminatory policies were of the nation, and they were manifested countless examples of inequality, of segregated health care systems. The question was how to eliminate disparities in health and attain professional medical care for all people. Racism in our medicine created and perpetuated poor health outcomes for the Black and other minority populations. In the South, hospital accommodations were frequently substandard. If Blacks were admitted to general hospitals at all, they were usually relegated to an all-Black ward. In some instances, white nurses were prohibited from caring for Black patients. Conditions in the northern part of the United States were also inequitable. It is reported that as late as 1912, only 19 of the 29 New York City hospitals would admit African American patients, and only 3 gave Black patients the right to tend to their own patients. So the Black physicians, there were only 3 hospitals that gave physicians the right to tend to their own patients or to perform operations. Racially exclusive Jim Crow laws dominated employment, housing, transportation, recreation, education, and also medicine. Black Americans were subjected to all of the injustices inherent in a dual medical care system. The National Medical Association, the NMA, is the nation's oldest and largest organization representing African American physicians and health professionals in the United States. It was established in 1895, and during the era when the United States history proved that the majority of African Americans were disenfranchised. The segregated policy of the separate but equal dictated virtually every aspect of our society. Under the backdrop of racially exclusivity, the members of the American professional organizations, including the American Medical Association, the AMA, was restricted to whites only. The AMA determined medical policy for the country and played an influential role in broadening the expertise of physicians. When a group of Black doctors sought membership in the AMA, they were repeatedly denied admission. Subsequently, the NMA was created for the Black doctors and health professionals who found it necessary to establish their own medical societies and hospitals. Conceived in no spirit of racial exclusivity, fostering no ethnic antagonisms, but born out of a energy of American environment, the NMA extended equal rights and privileges to all physicians. Although the NMA has led the fight for better medical care and opportunities for all Americans, its primary focus is to target health issues and the medically underserved. The NMA remains committed to improve the health status and outcomes of African Americans and the disadvantaged. Today, the NMA is a collective voice of more than 30,000 African American physicians and the patients that they serve. Now you're probably asking, what does this have to do with Pueblo, Colorado? Well, a history of the people of Pueblo, the Black people of Pueblo, written by Warren L. Fortson in February of 1980. He concluded that the Blacks were a part of a westward movement of people in the United States. They were with General Palmer as he founded Colorado Springs. He records many happenings with Black soldiers during the Civil War and the 10th Cavalry, organized in 1866. Most Blacks came west seeking employment. But by 1870, many of the Black employed in industries, but were also cooks, maids. They were masons, porters, saddle makers, barbers. They came from Georgia, Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and Texas. But by the 1880s, almost 2%, or 147 of Pueblo's population was Black. In 1890, the percentage increased to 2.87%. And in 1910, the Black population increased to its highest number of 3.2% of Pueblo's population. It was noted that Pueblo's Black community was larger than that of Colorado Springs and El Paso County. It was also stated that in earlier days in Pueblo that they had little residential segregation. Most of the African Americans lived in Pepper Sauce Bottom or on Goat Hill or downtown in Pueblo. The 1921 flood in Pueblo had a severe impact on the residents in downtown Pueblo. I share that because I just want people to get a feel for what it was like here in Pueblo. If you consider again that we had 13 African American doctors during the Civil War, and you consider that a lot of these schools were created in the South to help prepare African Americans to become medical professionals. We wanted to understand how these men decided to come to Colorado and also to Pueblo specifically. And I think this begins to help you understand. This next slide is just a slide of the former slaves that actually came to Pueblo and lived in Pueblo. I wanted to begin talking about one of the first, well, actually the first doctor that came to Pueblo. His name was Dr. Samuel Alfonso Huff. He was born on January 10th in 1879 and was a graduate from Mahari Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee in 1902. He came to Pueblo and opened his physician and surgery or surgeon practice in 1902. He enjoyed a large practice among his people and became a part owner of a drugstore at 402 West Northern Avenue in around 1906. On April 16, 1907, the Pueblo chieftain reports that he was appointed police surgeon. This is for the city of Pueblo. His duties were at City Hall, and his job was to prepare for any major emergency cases that might occur in the city. He had this job from 1907 to 1909. At that time, he left Pueblo and relocated in Denver. So Dr. Samuel Alfonso Huff. This next slide is his registration card for the draft. Approximately in 1910, he moved to Denver and continued his practice there. In 1918, at 39 years old, Dr. Huff registered for the draft. However, he did not serve in the military. Dr. Huff died on September the 11th, 1929, and was buried at Fairmount Cemetery in Denver. Dr. Simon Peter Douglas. Dr. Simon Peter Douglas came to Pueblo in 1905 and established his medical physician and surgeon practice. He and his wife, Susie B. Wheaton, lived at 113.5 South Union Avenue in the downtown area. Here's another picture of Dr. Simon Peter Douglas. By the way, these two photos are courtesy of the Pueblo Martin Luther King Holiday Commission and the museum. In 1907, they had a son. His name was, of course, Simon Peter Douglas, Jr. In 1910, the family moved to 1011 East Foreman Avenue. And Dr. Douglas passed away in 1920. His wife and he are both buried in Block 12, Lot 232 in Roselawn Cemetery. The next doctor is Dr. Jackson Silas Cobb. And he was born on September 13th, 1889 in Vienna, Georgia. He earned his Bachelor of Science degree from Payne College in Augusta, Georgia, and his medical degree from Jane Terrell Medical School in Memphis, Tennessee. He began his medical practice in Pueblo in 1923. During his professional career, he also served as the assistant Pueblo County physician, and he held that position for 16 years. Dr. Cobb was an active political and civil affairs. He was very interested in those things. He was the past officer and lifetime member of the NAACP, was a member of the Bethlehem Baptist Church. This slide is a marriage record for Dr. Cobb and Bessie L. Hall, and you can see the dates there. We also have his draft registration card, which was completed in 1942. Dr. Cobb was active until his death on October the 6th, 1965. At 81 years of age, he suffered a stroke, and he and his wife, Bessie, are buried at Mountain View Cemetery in Pueblo. Dr. Rufus Cardassius Red was born in 1890 in Virginia. He served in France during World War I in the quartermaster and medical corps. He was promoted to sergeant and received an honorable discharge from the Army. Dr. Red earned his medical degree from West Tennessee University in Memphis, Tennessee in 1918 and began practicing medicine in Pueblo from 1926 until 1958. He and his wife, Marie, were members of the St. Paul AME Church in Pueblo. Dr. Red passed away at Fort Lyons Veterans Hospital in Denver and had the services in Pueblo, and his body was returned to Martinsville, Virginia. I came to some conclusions as I was completing my research about these Black doctors that came to Pueblo. And so I want to just kind of go over some of those thoughts. It was said that there were similarities between Dr. Cobb and Dr. Red. Both of them graduated from medical colleges in Memphis, Tennessee. Both were married with no children, and neither of them knew their parents. They were very involved in the community and treated patients in Salt Creek and Bessemer neighborhoods. In fact, all four doctors received their education in Memphis, Tennessee. What is interest to me is what convinced these doctors, or who recruited and brought these doctors to Colorado and Pueblo specifically. There is some speculation that Dr. Corwin may have recruited these doctors to come to Pueblo. And there is a possibility that with Pueblo's growing minority population, that it remained undesirable for a white doctor to treat minority patients. I was told that minority employees at CF&I were not allowed in the medical clinic during the day. Is it possible that these African-American doctors were given access to the clinic after hours only? Those are questions that I think deserve some pause. Give it a thought.